So we are in the middle of a 6-part sermon series called It May Not Be Christian, But, where we are looking at the terms Christian and Christianity, and we acknowledge that there isn't just one way that that is interpreted. In fact, some of the interpretations of Christianity, many of us would find appalling. So we're digging into how that came to be, why that matters, and how that impacts our life. And we are about to go into part 2, which is 2 roads. Now, if you're familiar with that wonderful brewery, that is not what this is about. But this is called 2 roads. But before we go there, I want to give just a refresher from the first week in case you weren't here, or in case you were here and were sleeping, or just need a refresher. So, what we started with is we said, what is Christianity anyway? Just like, what is Christianity? And what we realized is there's no one answer to that. That there are many, many different versions of what Christianity is. And said, well, why could that be? The Bible must have told us what Christianity means, right? The Bible must have told us what Christianity means. But the reality is this. The word Christianity is mentioned never in the Bible. The word Christianity never appears in the Bible. However, the word Christian or Christians does, but only 3 times, never in the Gospels, and none of the 3 times is it ever defined. So the Bible, which we look to for some of these definitions, does not define what Christian means or what Christianity means. So we end up with these different roads that go along. Some people, in trying to figure out what Christianity means, have distilled it so tightly, that that literally you can put a formula together. This is my formula, so if you don't like it, you can reject it. And if you believe in this, that's okay. We're just going to be looking at different ways. But this is the formula for Christianity for probably at least 50% of people who call themselves Christians. And it goes like this. Negative A. Anybody remember who A was? Adam, right? So negative Adam, because he was the first one, supposedly in Christian theology of this type, who sinned, if the original sin, that then passed on along with our sins. So it's Adam, negative, plus times all of our sins since Adam. Everything we have ever done against God or against our fellow person or against ourselves that was counter to what God's dreams were for us, all that's multiplied together, and it makes this huge thing that made it impossible for us to be able to connect with God according to this particular version. But God figured out if you add Christ, specifically the blood of Christ, that evens out the ledger and everything's even again. So Christianity equals negative Adam times us plus the blood of Christ. That is the formula for the majority of the people, theology anyway, who call themselves Christians. And we noted that there's a problem with this because in the process of this formula, something is lost or someone is lost. And who is that? Jesus. Jesus is lost, right? So we got lost Jesus. If found, follow him. Okay? So that was basically the first week. So now we get into the second part called 2 roads. And while there are different forms of Christianity, and it's more complex than this, basically early on, there were 2 paths of Christianity. I'm calling 2 roads of Christianity. One was largely based out of Jerusalem and had a very Jewish flavor because all the people were Jewish. The other was one that was based on Paul and was very Gentile and a very different perspective. So we're going to look at the Jerusalem road and we're going to look at Paul's road today. So here's the Jerusalem road, and the foundation for the Jerusalem road is this right in here that we're going to talk about. These are the 12 disciples. After Judas died, they brought in another disciple, plus there were all kinds of other disciples. So there were lots of disciples, lots of followers, but who did they have throughout their life with Jesus? Who did they have throughout their life with Jesus? Jesus, right? So they had the opportunity to be with Jesus for about 3 years and experience the ups and downs of being with Jesus, get to know Jesus, his life, his words, his actions, his love one another as I have loved you, his actions like actually physically touching lepers or working with people who nobody was supposed to, helping the oppressed, helping the poor, helping prostitutes, thieves, all kinds of people, and they were seeing all the wonderful things that he did in his actions and all the amazing things he said in his words. And they went through a lot of emotional kind of roller coasters as well, because at first, yes, they started to follow him, and then they were like, wait, who is this guy? We're not quite sure about who this guy is. And then they started to really have faith and came to believe, and then they came to the cross. That moment where Jesus was tortured and crucified. And they went through that panic that this isn't what was supposed to happen to the Jewish Messiah. Because Jesus was Jewish and these people were all Jewish. And so the Messiah had a particular meaning to them, and the idea of a Messiah outside of Judaism had absolutely no context. It had no meaning. It made no sense to them at all because they were all Jewish, and they weren't planning on starting a new religion. They just thought they were fulfilling Judaism, that Jesus was here to be fulfilling Judaism. So when he ended up on the cross, that wasn't part of the plan, they thought. And so they scattered. But then they came back together to pray and try to be together, and then they found out that Jesus returned. So they had that whole thing from happiness to the cross to all that, but they had that time with the life, and they knew the human, living, loving Jesus with all of these wonderful characteristics, and went through the whole thing all the way through the actions that he did, as well as the very difficult times. So what they had was, they had questions right at the beginning, and were struggling with that, and then finally came to an answer about who Jesus was. So, Paul's church's road, had a different foundation. Paul's church's foundation was one of what I'll call conversion for ease of terminology. All right? So Paul's church started not even with Paul being called Paul. Paul was called who? Saul. Right. And Saul was a big friend of the early followers of the way, right? No, he was killing people. He was doing all kinds of things. So Paul did not know Jesus. Probably never met him. Historians think that Saul was in Tarsus during that entire period that Jesus would have been practicing in Galilee and Jerusalem. So Saul really did not know Jesus. And when Saul began to persecute people, and when he ultimately endorsed the stoning of Stephen, this is about 4 years after Jesus' death. All right, so sometimes you read in the Bible and it seems like, and this happened 5 minutes later, and this happened 7 minutes later. This is about 4 or 5 years later when he is on the road to Damascus, because he's already oppressed and persecuted the Jewish followers of the way so much over several years that a lot of them have scattered to different places. So now Saul has asked for permission from the high priest to go out to these other places like Damascus to root him out there and bring him back in chains or kill him or do whatever they think they need to do. And on that road to Damascus, this is Saul here with his little sword because he's going out to get people here. And all of a sudden, this bright light flashes that you heard from the reading. Right? The light flashes and he's like confused. He's like, "Who are you?" And Jesus says, "I am Jesus whom you are persecuting." So Saul/Paul didn't have all that life and actions and words with Jesus. He had this conversion experience. He got the answer first. He got the answer. "I am Jesus. I have risen from the dead, and I am still alive, even though you knew I was killed, and stop oppressing me because this actually really happened." He had the answer given to him right up front. And he has to start figuring out what the question is that he has to answer. So he starts thinking and thinking and thinking, and finally he figures out, he's like, This is Paul now saying, I have the answer to what Christianity is all about. And it was far different from the way. And his answer was, it's all about the risen Christ. Paul talks very infrequently about Jesus. The disciples typically talk about Jesus. Paul almost always, not universally, but almost always talks about Christ. So these are two very different roads, very different foundations from which they were looking at this early development of the faith. Okay, so now, fast forward about 20 to 30 years. Fast forward 20 to 30 years. The Jerusalem church has been growing and growing and growing with Jewish followers who have come to believe that, yes, Jesus is the Jewish Messiah. They are still going to temple a lot of the time. They still consider themselves to be Jewish. They just are Jewish followers of Jesus. So you have here one group, the people who had their Jewishness and Jesus, and these people were based in the Jerusalem area. And then you have a different group of people who basically are the Gentiles who live in a whole bunch of different cities, and their whole theology is the risen Christ, almost exclusively. So what happens is these two end up at a crossroads. They're interacting at different places, and there are all kinds of things that go on. Some of them are good, some of them are not good, but there are a lot of questions, and there's a lot of tension and a lot of confusion as they're trying to figure out how this faith is supposed to be going, because these two groups are trying to work together to some extent. But then we end up with all kinds of things that can be problematic. But there are periods of time when it went really well. And here in Acts 21, it says, when Paul arrived and the rest of us arrived in Jerusalem, the brothers from Jerusalem welcomed us warmly. The next day, Paul went with us to visit James. This James is the brother of Jesus. This is the brother of Jesus who was the biggest leader, along with Peter, of the Jerusalem Jewish-based church, known as James the Just. So Paul went with us to visit James, and he went to visit James because James was the man. He was the leader at that time. And all the elders were present, and after greeting them, he related one by one the things that God had done among the Gentiles through his ministry. And when they heard it, they praised God. When they heard it, they praised God. So there were periods of time when people here were getting along just fine. But there were also times when they were in negotiation, trying to figure out how we're going to coexist as you're doing one thing with the Gentiles and we're doing one thing with the Jewish people. And here is one example of that. Hey, it's in the same passage from Acts, just a little farther down, and it says, and this is just shortly after they talk about how wonderful this is. Great, it's awesome what you're doing. So glad that they are converting. But as for the Gentiles who have become believers, we've sent a letter to all those churches you were teaching, Paul. A letter with our judgment that they should abstain from what has been sacrificed to idols, and from blood, and from what has been strangled, and from what is fornication. Because Paul was telling them they didn't need to do any of the things that made someone Jewish. The Jerusalem group, because Jesus made no sense outside of the context of Judaism, were trying to tell people, look, before you can understand this Messiah, you need to become Jewish. And Paul, because he doesn't care about the life, he never met Jesus, doesn't care about the life and the words and the actions, just believes it's about the Christ who has risen, says all that stuff doesn't matter. So he's teaching people all that other stuff about Sabbath and circumcision and food rules and all these other things don't matter at all, which is what's causing tension with the people who thought this was very important. So they tried to come up with some compromises, and that's why they said, okay, you don't have to get circumcised, because if you're an adult male and you're thinking about becoming Christian, that's a fairly substantial impediment to conversion. Right? So they were trying to figure out ways to not make that as difficult for people, and people who had certain dietary ways that they wanted to do, they did not want to switch over to not eating what they used to eat. So they said, okay, we'll let you have those things, but we're going to compromise on something else. But even though there were some happy times, and even though there were some negotiations, there were some times when things were not going well at all. Not going well at all. And in here, also in the same passage from Acts, what happened when Paul came back to Jerusalem here for this meeting, there were a bunch of people, like by now there are thousands, tens of thousands of Jewish followers of Jesus in Jerusalem. And they've been hearing that Paul has now not just told Gentiles they didn't have to become Jews, but has been telling Jews they don't have to follow that anymore because that doesn't matter either. So the Jewish people are saying, they said, you see, brother, how many thousands of believers there are who are Jews, and they are zealous for the law. Which is ironic because that's what Saul was described as when he was going after the early followers of the way. He was called zealous for the law. They have been told about you that you teach all the Jews living among the Gentiles to forsake Moses, and that you will tell them not to circumcise their children or to observe the customs. But, not to be outdone, Paul has some things he wants to say to them as well. So, one of the things that he has to say is the following. When he's talking to one of his churches in Galatians, 1 Galatians says, I am astonished that you are also quickly deserting the one who called you in the grace of Christ. See, Paul talks about Christ, less Jesus, and are turning to a different gospel. Not that there is another gospel, but the other gospel is this Jerusalem gospel. And you're hearing from people who are perverting the gospel of Christ. But even if we or an angel from heaven should proclaim to you a gospel contrary to what I proclaim to you, let that one be accursed. Let that one be accursed. For I want you to know, brothers and sisters, that the gospel that was proclaimed by me is not of human origin. He's taking a shot at the human Jesus there, by the way. It's not of human origin. For I did not receive it from a human source, nor was I taught it, but I received it through a revelation of Jesus Christ when he had that moment of conversion on the road to Damascus. So then he takes that attitude a little farther and he said, and this is in 2 Corinthians, and what I do, I will also continue to do in order to deny an opportunity to those who want an opportunity to be recognized as our equals. He's basically saying, not only am I equal to them, I am better than all the apostles and anybody who ever actually knew Jesus. For such boasters are false apostles, deceitful workers, disguising themselves as apostles of Christ. And no wonder, get this one, even Satan disguises himself as an angel of light. So things are pretty tense here in terms of these two roads battling as to what's going to lay claim to the future of what will be Christianity. Then a few things happen. In 63, James, the leader of the Jerusalem church, is killed by the Romans. He's martyred. In about 67, Peter is martyred as well. And then in 68, Paul is also killed by the Romans. Now, so we now are left without the main leaders of either one. So we have the disciples and the people who had followed them, and we're farther along, we're like 40 years along now from after the death of Christ at this point. And then one major thing happens, because right now, both are still very, very strong. The Jerusalem and the Galilee area and all that area is really strong. And this one that's from many cities with the Gentiles is very, very strong. And then something happens. The Jewish revolt between 66 and 70. Around 66, 67, the people of Israel had finally had enough of Roman occupation and had certain messianic leaders who said it is time to overthrow Rome, and using certain tactics and with certain allies, they actually succeeded to do that for a period of time. And actually had a brief time of self-rule until Rome said, no, that's not going to happen. And Rome sent a disproportionate, because they wanted to make an example of Jerusalem so that anybody else, whoever tried to resist Rome, would see what would happen. So they sent a disproportionate amount of their army over to Jerusalem and destroyed Jerusalem. Took its people and sent them away. killed the Sadducees, and sent them away. Sent the people, distributed them all throughout the world. They destroyed the temple, and then they destroyed most of the other sacred places and most of the buildings all around the area where the Jerusalem, Jesus-based movement of the way was. So by the time that was done, that road was largely gone. There were a handful of people, a group of people who were still trying to bring it along, but the main base and the leadership and everything about that was that who knew Jesus and was following that version of the way was gone, which left us with one road left for the most part. Which was whose? Paul's, right? So Paul's road with the Gentiles, and that was spread out over many cities, so that was harder to put out. So this road can be defined again, and if you don't believe the formula that I put up here, from the reading from Romans, and I know that was dense and hard to follow. I had to write a 20-page paper on that paragraph once. I won't make you suffer through that, I promise. But Romans 5, 12 to 14, here's where this comes from. This is the last thing that Paul writes. He's in Rome. He's writing his theological, kind of his largest letter that has been preserved, and he is writing this letter not just to like some of the other churches that are just a letter to particular people. Yes, this is going to a church in Rome, but he's also trying to put down, he knows he's likely to get killed soon, and is trying to put some of his deepest thought that people can continue with going forward. And it says, therefore, just as sin came into the world through one man, right? And just as death came through sin, I'm going to take that as a negative. Is everybody on board with that one? Right? Sin causes death, that's a negative, right? So that's where the negative comes from, and the one man was Adam here, and then it spread to all. Just as all that spread to all, then just as like Adam, who was a type of the one to come. So this was Adam, and then there was the one to come to make this all good, and that person is defined by Paul in just a couple verses earlier, where he says, we were reconciled to God through the death and blood of his son Christ. That is the formula, and that is the road that early Christianity was left with. So what now? How did that impact the next 100, 200, 300, 1,000, 1,500 years later? That's the basis for the next sermon. See you next week. Amen.